A Wisconsin judge ruling there is enough evidence now to proceed to trial in a felony forgery case against an attorney and an aide to President Donald Trump. Jim Trupus, Trump's 2020 campaign attorney, and Mike Roman, Trump's director of Election Day operations then that year, both charged with 11 felony forgery charges related to the president's attempt to overturn his 2020 election loss in Wisconsin. Ken Chesborough, an attorney who advised Trump's campaign, had his preliminary hearing postponed amid questions about what statements he made to prosecutors could be admitted in court. Dane County Circuit Court Judge John Hyland suggesting a separate evidentiary hearing to determine whether those comments can be used.